we have then four speakers, and again, if people could speakers could introduce themselves and just say a little bit about their background before they start, that would be wonderful. But the first speaker is Ian Burst, who was based at the Colonial Office from 1952 to 61. So Ian Burst, giving to some extent the Colonial Office point of view, he was based there from 52 to 61. He was also seconded to the government of Kenya from 1954 to 56, and subsequently served with the East African High Commission. And just a personal note, is that not?
No, not quite. In '62, I was sent to Dar es Salaam as First Secretary for Technical Assistance when the new program was being opened. And from there, I was sent with the agreement of President Nyerere to be a consultant to IACSO as it has become.
Excellent, thank you. And just if I could say a personal note, many years ago, when I was writing my biography of Alan Noakes Boyd, Ian very kindly spoke to me about his memories at the time, and it added tremendously to my research, so I'm very, very grateful to him for that. So, Ian, please.
They were probably incorrect. Anything I remember, I found out to be false. The only way to check it out is to go to Kew, as I do sometimes. And you can check that out on the Diplomatic Oral Archives project at Church College, Cambridge. Well, a couple of things before we start. First of all, I hope everybody who wanted to got a cup of coffee. I know that at least I'm not going to fall asleep. Second thing is that a rather striking thing, that the whole of this morning and until now, no single reference has been made to corruption. Now, I mention it now, and I'm not going to mention it again, because I think you'll probably want to deal with that in the next seminar on the 29th of September, where it also is, of course, highly relevant. But when one talks about influence and all those other things, we're pussyfooting around that subject, aren't we? So, I'm going back to the beginning as well, in our end or our beginning, and then you will see what I have to say about the development of things in Kenya. Recently, I've been transcribing onto my computer the correspondence which I sent during the 50s and 60s to my parents' home, which they kindly preserved. And as I did so, I suddenly realized that these events, which were so fresh to me, had taken place 55 years ago. If I went back a further 55 years, which doesn't seem so long, I would be in at the beginning of Kenya's colonial history. The epoch of colonial rule was incredibly short, just a blink in the eye of history, but its achievements have transformed the continent. Now, the birth of what was to be a new nation had an ill-assorted group of godmothers. First, the international duty to suppress the slave trade, which led to the virtual cession by the Sultan of Zanzibar's rule over the coast, helpfully delineated afterwards by a rising young surveyor called Kitchener. Then, the cry of the missionaries and their many supporters for Britain to do something to stabilize things in Uganda. And that fell on ears uneasily conscious of their failure to rescue General Gordon. Third, the collapse of the traditional imperial trading company which had been set up to try to meet those demands. And lastly, the usual penny-pinching policy of the Treasury, insisting that new responsibilities had to pay their own way. You may notice some of these forces still at work with us today, although the UN creates the international mandates, and the do-gooder lobby is more concerned with human rights and the Millennium Development Goals than with saving souls. Now, Kenya itself was not created until 1920, and the 20s were filled by doubt and contention over all the main themes of later political debate. Whose interests should have priority? Should there be closer union with other possessions in East and Central Africa? How were land boundaries to be determined? both for the new foreign settlers and for individual African ethnic groups. And a battle raged in London between the India and colonial officers over the issue of a common voters' roll. African interests were represented in Legco by that formidable Scots missionary, Dr. Arthur, until the dispute arose with his and others' flocks over female genital mutilation. In London, a series of unstable governments rose and fell, but the call for European supremacy was quashed by the Duke of Devonshire's decree in 1923 that primarily Kenya is an African territory and that the interests of the African natives must be paramount. Now, after the 1939 war, policy took a more active stance towards development of all kinds. And in 1948, the Colonial Secretary, Creech Jones, staged a conference for the whole of British Africa. A rather up-to-date title. It's called Partners in Progress. See that on any billboard now in this country. At this, Creech Jones defined Britain's aim as to create the conditions of free nationhood in which responsible and democratic governments are supported by economic stability and sound social services. And he then called for greater cooperation by the people in the work of government and the need for them to develop a sense of public service. Now, Creech Jones concentrated mainly on developing African local government rather than expanding local representation in the legislature. Obviously, the first was urgent, although differing hugely in Kenya from the situation in Uganda with its traditional kingdoms. And I myself saw its importance when I was a DO in Kitui. But it was harder to tackle the central legislature when formal education, even at primary level, was so limited, and when the official side needed to keep control and to respond to Great Smith Street, as well as to balance the competing views of the various racial and indeed tribal groupings. The Mau Mau emergency ended plans for a constitutional conference in 1952, and the Littleton and Lennox Boyd constitutions in 1954 and 1957 had in effect to be imposed after some negotiation. The first, however, ended forever the idea of a non-racial, but effectively all-European government. And the second incorporated a feature we had long hoped to include, a form of common electoral roll for at least some members, which would encourage cross-racial voting. Direct election for the African communal seats, albeit on a fancy franchise, had taken place earlier in 1957. An event, incidentally, in which Milton Obote of Uganda played some part, helping Tom Mboya to defeat his Luo opponent. With Ghana's independence that same year, the office had to do some hard thinking about exactly what the proclaimed aim of responsible self-government should actually mean, and about timetables. It was believed that some territories were too small and precarious to be ever viable as independent units. Wherever feasible, it therefore seemed best to promote local groupings or federations which would be more likely, economically and politically, to survive. Only one of these, the UAE, endures today. But a predilection for a possible East African federation determined the pace and direction of much British policy, not least because of Julius Nyereri's personal enthusiasm for the idea. In a major internal conference at Chequers in January 1959, we tried to create a framework timetable that would allow separate progress for each country, but still leave open the possibility of all three arriving at independence within one federation. This timetable broke down almost immediately because Nyerere did not feel that he could delay political advance in Tanganyika. Now, the obvious concern about the Westminster Model was that the parliamentary model in our history could mean the tyranny of the majority, a system in which those with the largest majority trampled roughshod over the interests and rights of others. Now, minority rights, in fact, preoccupied everyone from 1918 onwards around the world. And of course, this led after 1945, amongst other things, to the European Convention on Human Rights. We were not just thinking in Kenya of non-African minorities, but of those in every land who are numerically weaker and perhaps seen as outsiders. On the file, I hope I may be allowed to quote my own remarks, which I had forgotten until Keith Carr brought them to my attention. I expressed it thus: what we really want to do, said I to my superiors, is to ensure that the minorities obtain not proportionate, but disproportionate representation, both in the executive and the legislature. Now, I think we were realistic in drawing lessons from elsewhere. If you could not easily moderate possible dictatoriate of the majority in the legislature, you might curb its successes to some extent by other means, such as including justiciable human rights in independent constitutions and creating independent public service and police and judicial service commissions. It was a great pity that Nyerere, otherwise a shining light, refused to include basic rights within Tanganyika's independence constitution and accepted them only in a declaratory and so unusable preamble. As moves towards Kenya's independence quickened, KADU, the party representing the smaller tribes and many non-African citizens, pressed for a form of internal federation, with separate regional governments set up on the Swiss model, with their own revenue and their own civil services. And these ideas dominated the second Lancaster House Conference in 1962. There will be a second chamber to represent the regions, as well as the usual parliament. The main provisions of the Constitution would be highly entrenched. Philip referred to that at the beginning. Majimbo, or regionalism, as it was called, was the clear price of proceeding while keeping Kenya a single political unit. So Maudling, who was then the colonial secretary, agreed to a modified form of KADU's proposals, but insisted on a coalition government, KADU plus KADU, to carry forward their implementation. Now, apart from the settling the regional boundaries, several separate civil services were needed within a public service where a huge effort was already required to localize or Africanize the machinery of government. Working up all the details and getting them agreed, meanwhile stifled some plans for action, for instance over agriculture, since KADU insisted that the constitutional bits must be settled first. In early 1963, another election was held under the Majimbo Constitution. This KANU decisively won, although 3 of the new regions went to KADU, and the Somalis completely boycotted the one in their region, which never started at all. KANU at once pressed successfully for changes to the new constitution, especially on the way it could be altered. And this was reinforced by pressure from Nyerere for faster Kenyan progress to independence, so as to allow the birth of a federation from the start. Kenya became independent under these arrangements on the 12th of December 1963, but there was no federation. And 1 year later, the Majimbo Constitution was scrapped, Kenyatta became executive president, KADU dissolved itself, and they formed a nearly national government with KANU. Only Oginga Odinga and his Luo allies were then neatly manoeuvred into opposition as the Kenya People's Union. Well, so much for Kenya. What about the East African arrangements? No federation, remember, that had been decided a long time ago, just the Governors' Conference transmitted a bit. At Uhuru, the three countries were still nominally in favour of a federation. But Uganda had already seen the disadvantages of this, and nothing happened. Things drifted slowly apart. Separation of the currencies on which Nyerere had insisted, without a common financial discipline, undermined the very foundation of any such union. The common market was badly damaged by quantitative restrictions on each other's exports and the closure of some land borders. It was not saved by the ineffectual system of trying to allocate different industries to different countries, regardless of economics or potential impact. The old East Africa High Commission, now mutated into the East African Common Services Organization, continued toothless and despised because run only by civil servants, able though they were. In early 1965, a halt was called to the slide into disintegration. With huge international support, a commission of the three states began work under an independent Danish chairman, Kjell Philip, he'd been Minister for Finance in Denmark, to see what should be done. Now, I had been sent to IACSO in early 1964 with private instructions to help either to revive it or give it a decent burial. And my appointment was cleared personally with Nyerere. The commission began badly. The appointed secretary, Joe Mensah from the ECA, refused to act in his role and claimed that of the chairman. For the first 2 or 3 minutes, no minutes were produced. Mensah went off in a huff and never returned. At this point, I managed to squeeze into the game as the chairman's personal assistant and advance the preparations for meeting. Crucial decision was to turn the as yet unagreed treaty into a report into a full treaty with all the accompanying laws. And the last few obstacles were negotiated away in June 1967, the Treaty of Kampala signed that day. Now, the East African community worked because there was enough in the package for everybody. Vitally, QRs were banned, a time-bounded internal tariff, half a common external wall protected Tanganyika and Uganda exports, and markets against the stronger. The East African Development Bank, which is still going strong, worked against heavy odds to allocate investments in rather artificial proportions to each country. Fairly loose surveillance governed areas like research and the universities. Landing rights were negotiated together, which was a great advantage. The common services were relocated. Each country was given 2 institutions. At Uganda, P&T of the bank, Tanzania, the community headquarters in the harbours, Kenya at the railways and the airways. Run as units, they continued to subsidise the loss-making elements in the weaker countries, particularly Tanzania. The solution to the political problem was accepted. Each government would appoint an East African minister, not part of its own government, to work together and give political direction to the community organs. They had a small central cabinet office. Each minister had a permanent secretary from a different country. They each belonged to all the councils and rotated their jobs every few years. So the political forces favoured working together and not pulling apart. Each president saw the advantage of appointing a good minister to hold his own against the others. And at the summit sat the 3 presidents as the authority. Commercial rules of the treaty were backed by a special tribunal, to which the authority appointed a distinguished jurist without his being told about it in advance. Ultimately, I don't think the community could have survived for many years because of the currency separation. But effectively it came to an end with Idi Amin. Nyerere would not meet him. the East African Authority could not sort out the increasingly neglected problems it was meant to settle. Nevertheless, the community was a triumph in its creation, and for a while it worked well. Obote got what he needed most, something which guaranteed its economic links with the rest of the world, but was not a federation in which he would have played third fiddle. In return, he had to make all the last-minute concessions. At the first meeting of the community, we received applications for some form of association between the EAC and 4 countries, Ethiopia, Somalia, Zambia, and Burundi. I was delighted to find that our officials then prepared for these talks with the same unity of mind and effort together as they had earlier shown in fighting their national corners.
Thank you very much. David Robertson will now read out David Allen's paper. David.
Thank you. Picking up something that Ian Hughes said to begin by referring to local government and the Priest Jones Memorandum. Hubert Allen's piece actually derives from that. He writes, an aspect of the Westminster Model that is often overlooked is the structure and functioning of local government, even though this, for the individual citizen, is likely to be the most directly relevant feature of the nation's polity. When I first arrived in Uganda in 1955, the new District Council's ordinance was in process of coming into effect, and much of the time of all field district officers was absorbed in trying to put it into practice. It very soon appeared to me that whereas the recent urban authorities ordinance could work quite well in the larger towns, the district council's ordinance was seriously flawed. This was largely because it sought to imitate far too closely the structure in those pre-Redcliffe Maud days of the rural district councils in England. And I mean England. Things were and are different in Scotland and especially in Northern Ireland. This was natural for 2 reasons. Firstly, it was the structure to which most of the British officers were accustomed. And secondly, the local people would have been very suspicious of our trying to impose on them any system which we did not use ourselves. But the consequences were inevitably problematic. To take just one example, an English rural district council needed to meet at least once a month, whilst every week at least one of its committees, and probably several, would demand the attendance of most, if not all, the elected councillors. Now the Gulu district, not one of the kingdoms that we have referred to, the Gulu district, in which I spent my first tour, was about the size of Wales. So to expect the councillors, many of whom were lucky if they owned a bicycle, to keep in touch with their constituencies while attending such frequent meetings at headquarters was manifestly absurd. We loyally tried to implement the new legislation and muddled through as best we could. But the system was clearly never going to work well. And the consequence was that local government, instead of serving the interests of the local community, became a mere agency of central government, totally subservient to central direction and control, as, it must be said, is increasingly the case here in England itself. This central control is to the liking of many regimes, but tends to override locally elected leadership and to offer very insensitive service to the local communities. Anyway, the conundrum retained my interest. And so, sometime after I left the colonial service following independence, I joined the staff of Birmingham University's Institute of Local Government Studies and devoted nearly all the rest of my active career to studying and teaching in the field of municipal government. This included 14 years as Director of Training for IULA, the International Union of Local Authorities, during which I arranged courses and seminars for local government personnel in very many parts of the world, and which led to my writing a book, Cultivating the Grassroots Why Local Government Matters, published by the All India Institute of Local Self-Government in 1990. In summary, I became convinced that the two most disastrous models of local government for countries emerging from colonialism are the British and the French. Most communes in the classical French model are far too small to exercise their putative powers and are therefore obliged to become subservient to the central dominating prefectures. Contrariwise, most English local authorities are far too large so that their actions can have national repercussions and consequently invite very tight control by Whitehall. Counties like Kent or Hampshire, for example, have annual budgets larger than those of nearly half the United Nations member states. This is regional government, not local community government. No model is without its problems, and all of them require adapting to local circumstances. But I believe that very many countries would benefit from considering Nordic or German or Dutch systems, or indeed the county manager system adopted by the first British dependency to achieve independence in the 20th century, the Republic of Ireland. However, this is neither the time nor the place to discuss these models. You simply have to read my book if you can see if I
plug at the end. Our third speaker is Mr. John Twining, who served with the administration of Uganda Protectorate from 1953 to 63, and was on 2 occasions Assistant Returning Officer at elections. John.
Well, thank you. A necessary component of the Westminster Model is the election by secret ballot of members of the legislature. And I'm going to describe my personal experience of 2 elections in northern Uganda, the 1961 election before self-government and the 1962 election, the last one before independence. The basic procedures were the same in both elections. Most of the country, if not all of the country, I'm not sure about Uganda, was divided into single-member constituencies, and success was first past the post. In order to vote, you had to be registered. In 1961, there was a limited suffrage. In 1962, there was universal adult suffrage. The registration took place some time before polling to enable lists of registers to be compiled and scrutinized and the eligibility of candidates to be checked. As a proportion of the electorate was illiterate, the idea of marking against a name on a single ballot paper was rejected, and instead there was at each polling station 1 ballot box for each candidate with the candidate's symbol stuck on the front. The ballot boxes were made of wood. They had a hinged lockable lid and a slot in the lid in which the voter would put his ballot to vote. At the polling station, the polling staff had booklets of detachable ballot papers with counterfoils, and the procedure was that they would, when someone showed themselves or identified themselves as a voter on the list, or marked the list, they would detach the ballot paper, they would mark the same voter's number on the counterfoil, and would emboss the ballot paper. The voter would go into a separate room, unseen by polling staff or anyone else, cast his vote in the ballot box of the candidate he supported. After polling, before the count, all the boxes in a constituency were taken to a central hall. They were inspected to see if they were properly locked and sealed. And then all the boxes of one candidate were opened and counted and recorded, put back and sealed up again. Then the votes of the next candidate were dealt with in the same way. I was Assistant Registration Officer in Chole, which, as we just heard, was then about the size of Wales. It had a population of between 400,000 and 500,000, spread out along not very many Murram roads. The Chole were homogenous people. They had some clan differences, but no major tribal differences. But they did have instead a decades-old fierce religious rivalry with between the Church Missionary Society and people who supported that, and the Catholics who read the Fathers. And these rivalries ended up in the voting patterns, with the Uganda People's Congress, UPC, voting for the Protestants, and the Catholics voting for the Democratic Party. We took training and preparation seriously, to the point which I think was made. Between June and November 1960, my vehicle logbook, which has survived, shows that I spent, I travelled some 3,000 miles on election business in the Chole district. And probably I spent quite a lot more in the DC's office Land Rover, and there were other district officers in the Chole who would have had similar responsibilities. There were three strands of our preparation: to explain the whole process to the populace, train the clerks and school teachers who were going to act as polling staff, and to register or oversee the registration of electors. There had been very heavy rains, a lot of flooding. I remember walking chest deep in a flooded tributary of the Aswa River in northwestern Chole, with ballot box on my head containing not only election literature, but also my dry clothes, and with my shoes hanging down around my neck. Somehow we got everywhere and explained everything to everyone. In the March 1961 election, I was Assistant Returning Officer in southwestern Chole, a fairly populous area, 10 to 30 miles from the district headquarters of Kulu. My task was to visit the 7 or so polling stations, deliver the boxes at the beginning of the day, check that everything was going smoothly, and gather the boxes at the end of the day and take them to account, and then supervise the count. The Chole took enthusiastically to voting. I put some printouts of photographs afterwards, which shows how, quite unlike British voters, they were quite prepared to queue for a long time in the sun, would be dressed in, not necessarily, possibly their best clothes, but certainly they were very well dressed. They dressed up for the occasion, and they were very peaceful. They didn't cause any trouble at all. And it went very smoothly. But then I visited 2 polling stations where things were going wrong. In one of them, the polling staff were writing the voters' registration number on the ballot paper. In the other, they were correctly writing the registration number on the counterfoil, but instead of embossing the ballot paper, they were embossing the counterfoil. Both cases technically were those that should have been rejected. And this was a problem because 200 people had voted by then in these 2 stations, and those 200 were virtually being disenfranchised by the errors of the polling staff. It didn't take more than a few minutes to get the procedures corrected for the future, but what to do about the ones that have gone. Well, after polling, before the count, I called together the two candidates and we discussed what we should do. And we came to the decision that we shouldn't disenfranchise voters who'd made themselves, well, made their intentions quite clear by how they voted. So we decided to count, and we did. The Democratic Party candidate had a narrow win. For some unknown reason, the UPC candidate did not ask for a recount, which might have caused quite a problem. But I reckoned that there would probably be an election petition, so I locked up very carefully the ballot boxes with the cast votes in them. There was indeed an election petition, and we went before a High Court judge who ruled eventually that it was all right to count the votes which had not been embossed because the number of them more or less matched the counterfoils. It was wrong, however, to have counted the votes, voting papers on which the numbers had been written, because the voters might have feared that someone could find out who they voted for. As the non-counting of those votes would have changed the election, a new election was called, held in September, it went smoothly. But this time the UPC won. Now, in the run-up to the 1962 election, someone was able to demonstrate to the governors, Alden Coutts and the Prime Minister, Ndikwe Kiwanuka, that it was possible for someone to go into the polling booth with two spokes of bicycle wheels stuck up his trousers. And it was demonstrated that he could use those spokes to fish the votes out of the candidate he didn't support, and stuff them in the ballot box the candidate he did support. And although I did hear some people laughing slightly, it was considered that this was a real danger, and so all the assistant returning officers were issued with a little piece of wood which they had to screw into the top of the ballot box to reduce the size of the slot. And also we were given an arrow to point to the smallest slot. Well, in the April '62 election, I was assistant returning officer of the South West Acholi constituency. This is an area of intense Catholic Protestant rivalry, and worry, there were concerns about law and order. And to answer one of the questions we had before, I was given a platoon of the 4th Battalion KAR to, as my strategic reserve, to suppress any rioting. There were 4 polling stations, 5 to 27 miles apart. The distance and the state of the roads meant that I could visit 3 of them twice and 1 of them once. Everything was going all right until I came to a polling station in a very strong Catholic area where there was absolute chaos. What had happened was, because this was the first election by universal adult suffrage, the Verona fathers knew the key to success was to drive to register as many of their flock as they could and get them to the polling station somehow. They included in their drive to register many elderly ladies who very seldom left their homesteads, but were somehow properly registered and got to the poll. That's where the trouble began. The separate room in which the ballot boxes were held was dark. Their eyesight wasn't very good. They couldn't easily find the hole of the slot at the top of the ballot box in which to put their votes. Some tried to put it in the slot between the lid and the main body of the box, some into the keyhole, and others exited the chamber to the voting booth to still clutching with their ballot paper. That, of course, was an election offence. The only thing to do was to start again, close it all down, line people on the start again. I was just about to do this when an army lorry drove up with Lieutenant Idi Amin sitting next to the driver. So I said to him, Lieutenant Idi, please could you get your men to clear the polling station so we can get the things working properly. He got his men off the back of the lorry, lined them up, and then gave the order, 6 minutes! And his men winkled the poor old ladies out of the polling station at bayonet point. Luckily, no one was hurt, and in this particular election, the Democratic Party won. Well, that took place half a century ago. I seem to remember fairly vividly things which didn't go right. My memory is very hazy of things which were routine. I have been helped by the survival of my vehicle logbook, which enables me to check on dates and places and distances. But if you want to follow up election procedures, my colleague Peter Lane, who's here today, gave, or presented, I don't know what you call it, presented to the Colonial Record Project at Rhodes Unit, at the Rhodes House, as it then was, complete files relating to the election procedures in the West Nile district. So, there we are.
Thank you very much. Our fourth speaker in the panel is Mr. Wyn Riley, who was Administrative Officer in the Gambia 1953 to 64, and then in Tanganyika from 1956 to 62.
Thank you very much. I intend to really follow what David Murray did this morning and talk about the questions that you asked. I will be rather less erudite, I'm afraid. I think the first question that I asked myself was, what sort of witness was I? This is supposed to be a witness seminar, and the speakers this morning all seem to be speaking from the top. No criticism, but very nice. And they knew about constitutional changes in the big perspective. I certainly didn't. I was a pretty lowly district officer 50-odd years ago in Nachingwea district and in Mtwara district. I don't think we were concerned about even TANU at that stage, although we'd heard of TANU, the Tanganyika African National Union. No, I was much more interested in being a DO. My first job was to supervise the building of a bridge over the Mbwankulu River, which divided Nachingwea district into the north and south. And it was a beautiful bridge. The only trouble was, in the first rains, it was found 3 miles downstream. But that was the sort of life that I enjoyed, nothing to do with constitutions. However, I had, as you mentioned, I was in the Gambia as ADC and Private Secretary, Sir Percy Wyn Harris, and since he was my godfather, as you would expect, I was fairly close, and therefore I did get a sort of bird's eye view of what was happening in a small, very small territory. I learned something about EXCO and LEGCO, hardly avoided, they were in the next office to me. So I wasn't totally unaware of the things at the summit, but not within Tanzania. Now my third move, the next tour as it were, was to a district called Gaeta, up in the Lake Province. This was a very interesting district, very boring architecturally as it were, the landscape was boring. But what was interesting was that there had been a very autocratic district officer there, I forget his name fortunately, and the whole administrative system had blown apart. I think that Julius Nyerere was flexing his muscles at the time. This would be about, I suppose, 1958, if I remember. And administration broke down, and the DOs had to get out rather rapidly. Gradually, a very competent district officer who spoke not only fluent Swahili, but also the local language, whatever it was, managed to go around, get things together, and government had the sense to post the best African officers that they had into the district. And I was extremely fortunate, I think, in being posted there. So, for example, I think out of 13 gazetted officers, 7 were African, all of whom rose to top positions. I used to go guinea fowl hunting with Hamza Aziz, who became the Commissioner of Police. Joe Marta, I'm glad to say, who went to Trinity Hall, Cambridge, he was a fellow district officer, and he became the head of the civil service. They gave me a kind of, because we talked a lot, an idea of their feelings and the way they were them, my witnesses. Jonah Marta became, as I said, head of the civil service, and I was listening to 6 o'clock news on my way home on car radio in 1967, just after UDI, when it was announced that a certain Mr. Joseph Namata, the head of the civil service in Tanganyika, had ordered all the witch doctors in Tanganyika to cast a spell on Mr. Smith. From a gator, which, as I say, was interesting from the point of view of not only talking to these guys who were looking their way to the top, but it was also a district in which attempts were made to launch the new form of district council. And this meant going out on numerous barazas. I think most of my time was spent doing this, attempting with local officers and former members of the council, speaking in these barazas and trying to get people to understand what democracy at the local level was about. It's important because actually it was quite a hard task. I'm not sure that we succeeded. The next posting, before I answer the questions, was to Mzumbe, which was the administrative training centre, started far too late to train African district officers. So this gave me an opportunity of getting to the feel of what the budding district officers were thinking, what their approach to independence was. And we also, of course, brought up people from Dar es Salaam. Rashidi Kawawa, who became Prime Minister a little later, came up and spoke to the people. Oscar Kambona, who became Minister of Defence. He gave a very good speech. He came up with a written speech, chucked it to one side, and just told us that, although independence was just about to come, there was no intention of Africanizing the police force. He couldn't afford to. They were technically qualified, experienced. The next day, he went back to his office and Africanized the police force. Now, getting to the questions, to what extent is the Westminster Model considered suitable? The question I asked when I read this was, considered by whom? I assumed that the Colonial Office, but you know better than I, thought it was a good thing. So they thought it was suitable. I imagine that the Governor, Richard Turnbull, also thought it was a good thing, but again, you can comment on that. Lower down, I don't think we gave it much thought. We never thought, well, what would be the alternative? What is going to happen? We didn't know. This is the model we use. This is what everyone expects. So fair enough. And the people like Kamsa and Joe, I think they just had one thing in mind. I may have got it wrong. Basically, what we want is Uhuru, because then the channel opens for us to go up, which indeed it did. And after Uhuru, well, things can be changed. And indeed they were. I suppose you, at the grassroots level, to be honest, I really don't think anyone had a clue. If you said, what do you think of the Westminster Model? What would the ordinary two have said? I asked myself the question, well, was it suitable? And here I think you'll probably come back at me with like a ton of bricks. Well, in the short term, I don't think it was suitable at all. But I'm not sure what else would have been. I've no idea what alternative. I didn't know much about the French, and I don't suppose anyone else did. or the Soviet, or the German, or what have you, or even as Hubert said, the Nordic. It's interesting that I believe, but I haven't really followed this up, but I believe around about 1980, we did have in Tanganyika multi-party elections. TANU came out top, but the one-party system basically ceased about 20-odd years after independence. Now, I don't know what you think of this, but we all sort of speak as though we ran the colonies in a pretty democratic way. Now, my feeling was we ran it purely as a dictatorship and one-party rule. The one party were the Brits. We didn't have many other people. We had a few, no, not many other people. We had very few in Tanganyika, big voices from Tanzanians themselves. I think it was a dictatorship. I like to think it was an extremely benevolent one, a pretty honest one, but I can't honestly see the... as a district officer, or when the DC was away and I was district commissioner, I was actually, because there was no gazetted police officer, I was in charge of the police, so I could arrest a guy in theory, I suppose. I was a magistrate, so I could imprison him. There was no prison officer, so I could imprison him. It worked pretty well, because I think we made it work, but it wasn't, as I saw it, and you may see it differently, it wasn't to me the multi-party, let's have a vote, clear separation between the powers. I think the judiciary was separate at the top levels, but not necessarily the district. So I'm not sure what kind of example we provided, is all I'm saying. Well, what other forms of government were considered? I'm not aware that any ones were, other ones were. As I said, I think Julius Nyerere and the TANU party were quite concerned that this would be one-party rule under African socialism. Julius wrote a very good book about it. And I don't think there was any intention to play the game as had been planned. How much preparation was there? Well, again, I don't think it was much. You see, ATC, the Admin Training College at Mzumbe, was started very late in the day. As a pretty junior district officer, I had a bit of a row with my provincial commissioner, who called me and said, I gather you're a bit sort of talking out of turn. And what's wrong? I said, well, I can't understand it. It is now late 58. And I believe that we will have independence within 5 years. I've listened to Professor Harlow's lectures about colonial history with great interest. I've spent a bit of time in West Africa. This talk by the then governor, your father, was talking, I believe at the time, or said to be talking, about independence in 25 years' time. And I said to the PC, well, to me it is rubbish, and we have to train people. We're not training any people to take over from us. So anyway, he went away to PC's conference, came back and said, right, that's your next job. So I was a founder member of the ATC. But this was only started 1 year before independence. And we had no idea what would happen afterwards. The DOs we trained, of course, became district officers for a very short time, and then the whole lot were politicised under Nyerere within a year. How effective and durable were the democratic structures? Well, I think probably said enough. What were the democratic structures? The local government worked quite well, but I'm not sure it was entirely democratic. It functioned, and there were elections, and I think the people elected were, in fact, pretty representative. A National Assembly did exist, but then, of course, I don't know how powerful it was, and it was only, I can't remember exactly, I think it was only formed out of LegCo about a year or 2 years. How long?
Going a long time, LegCo intended.
LegCo had for ages, yes, but not the National Assembly as such.
No.
No, sorry, that was the point I'm making. No, LegCo was there for a long time. It was a de facto one-party state. There was a thing called the Tanganyika Federation of Labour, which the government tended to back a little bit, but that was absorbed by TANU pretty close, I think, in 1960. And local authorities, well, we did succeed in creating these just around the time of independence. Final question, what attempts to adjust the constitutional arrangements? Well, by about 1963, I'm not precise on time, all provincial commissioners and district commissioners had been superseded by political appointees, which is a very, very significant, something which did not, of course, happen under Kenyatta in Kenya. All executive powers were removed from the chiefs. The native authorities were mostly replaced by district councils, but they themselves were abolished a few years later, and then reinstituted many years later. A grand scheme of villagization was introduced. Not a good idea. The strange thing is, in Tanganyika, villages were people spread out. They lived on their farms, which made good sense. And in the middle were the dukas, Mr. Patel, and so on and so forth, the court, and perhaps the school. Julius Nyerere is said to be for more effective farming, but I think myself much more to do with political control, voluntarily, in quotes, moved people into these compact villages, a fairly disastrous change. And the cooperative movement, which had been very effective in the commodities of cotton and coffee in appropriate areas, was enlarged to cover the whole area and a whole range of products, many of which were not exported but were locally used, things like maize. A rapid change which fell to pieces. Well, it's rather incoherent, I'm sorry about that, but that's, I think, about it. Thank you very much.
Very well, we have until 3:30 for questions, and again, as before, I just ask people, if they haven't spoken before, just to identify themselves when they ask questions, so please.
Michael Shaw, Tanganyika, and then 18 years on good governance and security sector reform in the Third World. About 12 years ago, I was involved in a local election, and the returning officer supervised the votes being counted, stood on the steps, announced the result. The two candidates who'd won congratulated each other. The two losing candidates made gracious speeches. Their straw polls had shown that they had expected rather more votes, but still this was democracy in action. The candidates and the returning officer left, and the local staff, locking up, found 2/5 of the votes in boxes in a neighbouring room. Unfortunately for the story, it didn't actually affect the result. But the local paper reported this deadpan. They did not take up my challenge when I wrote to them to ask how they had reported this story if it had been in Kenya, because it actually happened in the Chichester district of West Sussex. Sometimes I think other countries need to do as we say, not as we do.
Could I just add something though? We have representatives from the Royal Commonwealth Society here today. At the last election, they organised a Commonwealth monitoring group to observe the British general election, which seemed a little bit of a gimmick at the time. And then, of course, everything went pear-shaped on polling night. And having been, the tabloids had these columns saying, how dare they come over here and observe the Mother of Parliament. When they had a press conference the following morning after the general election, the coverage was very sympathetic and enlightened. So rather proves your point. Sorry,
I was the returning officer who organised the election in my last district in Ancona, which is about, one of the kingdoms. And I can just 2 points. One is that there was tremendous local support. The registration for the 62 election on the universal suffrage was 120,000 in a population of 500,000. And second point was that there was one interesting switch between 61 and 62 where the Muslim voters joined with the UPC to swing a seat away from, as it were, the Catholic voters and the Democratic Party. But to get to the more general point, local government, I think, worked fairly well. Much of it was tribal. My first district, it was one particular tribe, and that was the district. And they'd had public voting, I mean the elections, since 1940. So there was a well-established local government system. The trouble was that there were a number of factors that made it almost impossible for Uganda to take easily to, as it were, what I think we understand as the Westminster Model. Firstly, the first general election on a limited franchise was 1958. There was another one in 1961, 62, final election, independence. 4 years. You cannot get a system bedded down in 4 years. Secondly, what had been referred to before as religious divisions. I mean, again, my second district, which is in the west of Uganda, there had been religious wars there. There was bitter rivalry between the Catholics and the Protestants. Protestant UPC, Catholics DP. And the voting was pretty well standard, you know, along religious lines. There was a position of rulers. In addition to, of course, Baganda, there was Bunyoro and Ankoli. And I read the papers on the Ankoli discussions about the position of the rulers and how this would be reflected. In practice, of course, it was treated just as another district, but an agreement was signed after the final election in 62, and it came to 42 pages. And it was absolutely meaningless. We were going through a kind of charade. And of course, within a couple of years, all the rulers had been moved, been chucked out. So there was no sort of constant basis. And then there was a deep tribal differences between the north, of which Obote came from, because he came from Lange in the northern province, and the Bantu part of the south, particularly Baganda. It was quite clear that there was going to be a day of retribution, I think, by the people dominated by the north against the Baganda and the Bantus in the south. And these are conditions which really did not bode well for the future, all these various elements. I won't go into all the details of the training of administrative officers to take over, which again had started in the early 50s but had not gone nearly far enough. And so I don't know what we could have done to change the situation. One final point, police and army. You see, Obote did not trust the police because he regarded them as a colonial hangover. He built up the army, which of course was to be headed by Armin, and of course got the balance completely wrong. I mean, he increased the size of the army, and the police were pushed to one side. He hadn't got the political experience to realise that if you're going to have powerful bodies like the police and the army, you balance them. But he didn't. And all these various elements, I think, were really the fruits of not enough time. Not enough time. We started too late, perhaps, but it was not enough time.
I'll take 2 more questions and then straight up and then have a second round. Peter,
Thank you. Unfortunately, I've got to go to Bingham's memorial service. I won't be able to stay for the second question, so some of my points might overlap. One of our speakers said I hadn't heard the word corruption mentioned, and I was a bit surprised that nobody's mentioned indirect rule.
Yeah.
Because you, madam, at the beginning said, was there any attempt to build on traditional authorities? And the nostrum of colonial rule, which Arthur Benson in Northern Rhodesia maintained until the late 50s, was that, quote, Westminster style party democracy is totally unsuitable for Africa, and the best way was to build up traditional authorities. But now, why that didn't happen, I just suggest one reason is that the African nationalist leadership actually thought that that was the sort of second best thing. And what they wanted was what they'd learned about at the LSE, a sister college in the university where I used to teach humanity. Sorry, I forgot to explain who I am. I'm Peter Slynn. I was an assistant legal advisor at the Commonwealth office in 1967, and then I went into academia, and I've spent the rest of my scholarly life, I suppose, as a student of Commonwealth constitutional affairs. So that's one point. The second point, I think, is I think we'll be searching for the impossible, trying to work out where the Westminster Model actually worked and where it didn't work. In some of the most homogenous societies in independent Commonwealth have had the most turbulent political history, like Lesotho, like Tonga, which I visited 4 or 5 years ago, and so on. The other point, of course, is that some societies, and Tonga is the only place in the Pacific that I visited, are not in the least, as some of the speakers said before, don't believe in equality. Tongan society, Samoan society was based on an elite who once upon a time had a complete monopoly of political power. So that's another point. The point about, the third point I'd like to make is, if you look at I've just come back from Zambia, where I was attending, at the invitation of the Chief Justice, a colloquium of Southern African Development Community judges. And if you look at things from the perspective of what happened in the post-colonial period, you had this one-party state era, which was the nostrum of the time. The International Commission of Jurists produced a report in 1979 that said the one-party state is the best way of achieving democracy. But by the 90s, that had all changed, and most of the one-party states of our region returned to multi-party democracy. And in fact, the constitutions which they've got now bear, in many ways, a remarkable resemblance to the constitutions of independence. The independence of industry is enshrined and may be abused in various ways, including the use of the Judicial Service Commission and so on. The other public service commissions remain intact. The idea of a presidential government, the adapted Westminster Model, they went straight to that in Botswana and Zambia. The first constitution of Zambia said the first president of the republic will be Kenneth David Kaunda. It actually said in the constitution. So basically the Westminster Model, you could say, was a device where you found, right, these national leaders won't be satisfied with anything less than a quasi-Westminster system of democracy. We identify the people who are going to run it, Kaunda, Nyerere, Kenyatta, Soretsikama, and off you go. And actually what they've got now is really, if you look at Zambia, it still has, a presidential executive, it has a multi-party system, it has an independent judiciary, and of course the real problem, as somebody said, is corruption. Sorry about that.
Thank you very much. Please, go away.
Right, thank you. Charles Cullimore, trying to stand up so that I be heard, because my voice is not really clear at the moment. But I started off life as a as a DO, a very lonely junior DO cadet in Tanganyika, as it was then. And then fast forward many years to being High Commissioner in Uganda. And I hadn't really thought about that much until I realised that this was happening, and I began to think about the comparisons of, so where to start? Well, briefly, first of all, can I very much sort of second what you were saying earlier about our experience in Tanganyika, in the sense of how quickly it all happened and how little we had thought about Westminster Model, for goodness sake. I don't think the phrase was even used in my hearing or to my knowledge while I was there. One could speculate that what really happened was that the government here decided, for all sorts of reasons, which we needn't go into now, that we had to get out quick. And we had the Winds of Change speech in 1960, which took an awful lot of people, I think, including us on the ground, completely by surprise. And suddenly there was a new ballgame for which we, as you said, had not prepared. And then there was very little time. So anyway, then fast forward to Uganda, early 90s forward. As distinct from the Museveni version of a non-party democracy, as he would call it. And I found then, and I still find, that his arguments in favour of what he was doing, although of course they were and are self-serving, and that's the problem, they serve to keep in them, they also have a real validity, and I think partly address the issue of was the Westminster Model suitable. They don't address the issue of what's the best alternative, that's another problem altogether. But was it suitable? And I would say certainly as far as Uganda is concerned, and very much agreeing with what Patrick said, the problem in a country like Uganda, with its very intense tribal divisions, ethnic divisions, not just intertribal from the same basic group, but fundamentally ethnically different people. And the still then, and I think now, very live religious divide, to which we can originally attribute the rivalry between the French and the English, French/Catholic, English/Protestant missionaries, which is still a live issue today. Right. So when you impose on that background a Westminster model, it serves to exacerbate all those divides, because there is no cross-cutting, cross-national issue to which people can unite. They tend to vote Catholic, or they tend to vote as their fellow Bahanda would vote, and they don't. So it's not, and therefore it doesn't work terribly well. But one last quick thought, and I don't want to take too much time. The other thing we haven't mentioned is India. Now, I guess we don't have an awful lot of expertise on India, but perhaps we, somewhere, maybe another seminar, should discuss why has India been such a fantastic success story for what you could very loosely call the Westminster Model. And I remember attending a debate in the Lok Sabha lower house years ago when I was at the High Commission in Delhi, and very lively, more lively than here. And there was a fellow at the back jumping up and down, trying to catch the speaker's eye, exactly as you would do at Westminster. Finally, he caught the speaker's eye. The speaker had actually been having to intervene a great deal because the members were being very rowdy and noisy and in a very delightful Indian way. I think it was about the price of onions, if I remember rightly. Obviously an issue that mattered. And finally, he caught the speaker's eye, and so he was given the floor, and he said, what he said was, Mr. Speaker, he said, I am thinking that in the House of Commons, the Speaker is hardly ever speaking. And in this House, the bloody Speaker is speaking all the bloody time.
I'm going to let the panel respond while we still remember the points, and then hopefully we'll have time for another round. So, Ian, would you like to...
Yeah, first of all, Nyerere, Tanganyika, and the whole idea of unity. I think we completely underestimate the psychological appeal of including everybody together within the society and making them part of a common effort, which I think was the whole of the steam behind the Nyerere philosophy, basically. And this bears later on, because you did not have in Tanganyika a situation with everybody crowded together and competing for jobs. Everybody was spread out over the whole land. it was possible, for instance, to issue a decree saying that nobody would have any more lunch in the government offices. They would work the same hours as messengers. Messengers couldn't afford lunch, so why should everybody else? And that was a very sort of small signal how near a reform. But remember that he was a philosopher king. We knew when they went into independence that he had his own ideas. He retired from being actively in charge, left Commonwealth there for a whole year, and did his thinking. Came back, some of the ideas were rubbish. Some of them we helped him put into effect, like villagization. I remember that myself. That worked in some areas, but it didn't work in others. Well, I would mention one or two where we had some, including Schoolman and around the lake in once at Bomani land and Cotton area. So I do not, however, think that it applies to Uganda, or indeed perhaps for Kenya, because people's allegiances are not Catholic and Protestant, they're to their own people, whoever those are, and where there are long traditions of difference and competition, it doesn't work. Now, in Uganda, the question of the army came up, and the police. And I may say that when I was in charge of British aid to Africa, we put a lot of effort into trying to strengthen the police force, because we could see that that was really important. But we were up against something which Obote perpetrated with Amin, and that was, of course, the great scandal of sending arms through to the Congo rebels who are pretending fine relations with Mobutu in exchange for arms and ivory, in exchange for gold and ivory. And when all that came out, I mean, the whole thing could not have worked when you have people with that kind of approach to power. Now, if I go on quickly to the other point about Tanganyika, which nobody's mentioned, this is the decolonization committee and public opinion. It said, yes, that Britain was all ready to scuttle because of the pressures of the Americans and other people, but we had also a mandate in Tanganyika, something we did not have in the other countries. To that we had to report every year to this committee in UN, and they used to pester us uphill and downhill. Who was behind that? Mostly Nkrumah, of course. Nkrumah had ambitions to be president of the whole of Africa, which is why he opposed things like the East African Community. These factors were important in London as well as, and I haven't mentioned them, so I'm glad there's a chance now. Judges, one more point about the judges. When I was in Nairobi in 1983, and I was then in charge of British bilateral aid to Kenya, I had a difficult fight with the Kenyan authorities. Why? Because they insisted that they wanted us, the British, to go on subsidising the cost of the British judges who were in the High Court. And I had instructions from the policy people back in London, no, we had to bring this to an end. Let them have their own judges look after themselves. The result was I think we gave them 2 or 3 years more and then pulled the plug on it. But that doesn't entirely signify the desire to have the judges under your political thumb. I think what's happened finally in Kenya now in relation to a new constitution is very significant, and it demonstrates particularly the rise of the third sector, the rise of civil society in a way which wasn't possible perhaps for various reasons 10 or even 20 years ago. And that I take as encouraging on the whole, but it needs to be something which we all perhaps need a new take on. And I wish I had the expertise and knowledge to do anything about it.
Thank you very much. John. I suppose to take up something on the indirect rule. In Uganda, the indirect rule for most of the country was the Uganda system imposed from the top. It wasn't building on, or necessarily in all cases, building on local chiefs and local traditions, because the Uganda was
trying to say a brief word or two about Kenya.
Oh, sorry. I think we're just let the panelists respond, and then I'll
basically, you had paid chiefs who were sort of local civil servants, and certainly in the early years, these were resented very much by the populace, particularly in Bunyoro. So it was a slightly artificial system. It hadn't had really long enough, well, it had 60 years, but it's not really long enough to it is.
Thank you very much. Win.
No, not really. I'm just on this indirect rule. It certainly existed in Tanganyika. Cameron followed Lugard's principles and applied it to Tanganyika. I think I'm right in saying that in a number of districts the chief was very highly regarded. There's a long tradition of native chiefs. And even when they were banned, I remember going with a friend of mine to Bukoba, and behind the scenes there were elections for the chief, despite the fact that he wasn't supposed to be there or doing anything. In other places, down in Nachingwea, the Lawali was simply appointed by the government. But it worked reasonably well. I don't think there was much antagonism, and I think the system was fairly effective. Okay.
Look, please, okay.
I may just rise again. Of course, Kenya has been mentioned in the last few minutes. It's a country where anything can happen, it usually does. But two snapshots. When I went out as a young cadet DO to Kenya in 1951, a month or two afterwards, my district commissioner was talking about the need to bring bright young Africans further forward. Of course, there was a rank, it's called African Assistant District Officer, which is quite prestigious for the locals, but it stopped, it had a ceiling. And he said that they'd got a very bright young health inspector in central Nyanza, next door to South Nyanza where I was. And he and the provincial commissioner felt that this chap should be admitted into the ranks of district officer, because he really wanted to. High degree of motivation. Name was Tom Lawyer, and who of course became quite well known afterwards. And if he hadn't been unfortunately assassinated at independence, he probably would have done great things. So that is in answer to the thing, should we have started earlier? I think the answer was yes, because at that stage the proposal went up to Government House and was turned down with regret by the governor because he hadn't got a British university degree. So he and several others, a year later, went off to the States. I think Lincoln College in Nebraska comes to mind. And they came back, well, with different ideas. The second snapshot is towards the end of my time. In 1962, I've been in Nairobi for a couple of years in central government, and I was suddenly asked, would I like to do a special safari trip? And this was that the government and the British government wanted to know, should we let Kenyatta out or not, who was then still in detention? And would I please put on my wide colonial shorts and sit underneath a tree, various trees, and ascertain from the loyalists, those who had supported the British in the Mau Mau thing, in the Kikuyu, Embu and Meru districts, which occupied 3 or 4 months of my time. And this covers a point I think I made in connection with Kiribati, that some people, they don't understand voting. And they like to have a barometer which goes on and on until they can all see which way the wind's going, then they'll go. And this happened. And actually there are very few saying he shouldn't be let out. And it was a fairly easy run. They gave me a good tour around the highlands of Kenya, including 3 or 4 districts I had not been to. And it showed that the unity of purpose is a great thing. Certainly amongst the tribes which haven't had the full benefits of Western education. Of course, there's a very great difference between some districts and other districts. So I'll say no more, otherwise I'll ramble on.
Thank you very much. David.
David Kernbury. I was in Tanzania in the mid-60s as a school teacher, and for much of my academic life since then I spent my energies studying the colonial system. Can I say that I endorse what Riley said about colonial rule having a, I didn't say a heritage, but I'd use the word, a heritage of autocracy, as well as a system that was based on race. I use the word heritage so that you can, in a sense, count yourself out of that, although inevitably, if you were in the system, you were part of it. And I'm prepared to take flack for saying that. Also, the change was hasty. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And that African politicians were driven by various pressures to advance independence. For example, Nyerere, I seem to remember in the late 50s, said that it would be another 25 years before Tanzania, or Tanganyika then, would be ready for independence. Lumumba told the Belgians that it would be 5 years from 1960 onwards, and it all came abruptly. And that rapidity of change, because it's not only because the international clock is against colonialism, but also there are pressures on Britain to dispose of empire. But if we talk about what is the Westminster Model, it means lots of things. I suppose one of the things that it does mean is a system of government for a multi-party democracy. And if we take Tanzania, the elections, and when briefly referred to them, I remember the election, I think it was of 1966, TANU, which was by and away the largest political party. And here I think we need to be careful how we talk about politics. We tend to think about political parties, and yet politics, and we see it in our own society, comes in different shapes and sizes in all sorts of things. And it does also in Africa. It's not just about parties. But certainly within Tanzania, whatever TANU represented, did represent this monolithic party which had an appeal for the very natures that made Tanzania different from, say, Kenya. Its lack of ethnic conflicts, its single language in Swahili and so on. But it was going to win elections, clearly was. And in the election, I think it was of 66, I can't remember the exact number, I think it was 150 members for the National Assembly. And 140, when the election results came through, there were 149 for TANU. And there was one person who had, in the southwestern constituency, who had changed parties in the middle of the election, and I suppose confused the electorate, and who was elected. And so the old assembly system, you had the government on one side and you had the loyal opposition on the other. 149 on one side, one on the other. Clearly made a nonsense of the Westminster Model and whatever we did. And Nyerere then took hold of the system and said, well, we have to recognise what we've got. I remember coming back from Tanzania infected with Tanzaphilia. I have removed much of those layers, though I still have a drawing of the man on my wall and I haven't taken it down yet. But he then had to work out how you had a system of voting for rival candidates from the same party. And that was what was done for the next election, with two candidates, admittedly from time, but representing different things, which I think has come back to this point that I made about what do we actually mean when we mean politics? It means something very different to people at all sorts of levels on different places.
Yeah, thank you. Any more, couple more comments, and then I think we've got to wind up.
May I?
Yeah, please.
Peter Lane, Uganda. One aspect in favour of the Westminster Model, not much dealt with today, is the question of universal adult suffrage. Very popular in Uganda, and I suspect over most of Africa. And the aspect totally new, that women would have the vote. It won't happen until women tend to not vote as their fathers or husbands. And I deal with the tribal scene, I remember 50, 60 years ago. Until women can throw off the influence or the dictate of their fathers and husbands, it may not have a great significance. But already there are female ministers of independent governments, and I look forward and expect a considerable deviation back to what we think as the principles of Westminster government and suffrage when they take a full and independent part.
Thank you very much.
John Barton, Tanganyika. Professor Kingley invited, perhaps expected a bit of flack. His reference to colonial rule in Tanganyika having a racist component. At least that was the implication. It's true that all the senior posts in the civil service were filled by Europeans at the time, speaking in the 50s. And this derived simply from the fact that there weren't enough sufficiently well-educated Africans to swell their numbers. And those of us who were young Turks at the time thought that there should have been a very much more rapid recruitment of Africans into the civil service with a view to that promotion based not on education but on what we perceived as their potential. That didn't happen, but I don't think there was anything ulterior about that. And could I just make one point with regard to indirect rule? One of the things that bedeviled progress to independence and has bedeviled government in Africa post-independence is tribalism and a lack of any concept of nationhood, at least during the early years of independence. And I wonder to what extent indirect rule, well meant as it was, and whilst it worked very well at local level, was also divisive and inhibited the development of a sense of nationhood. I chuck that out as a speculative thought.
Thank you very much. I think we'll probably return to the theme of indirect rule and a number of other themes that have come up in the next session. But I think we should wind up now and have coffee.